Great. So thank you so much. I am very happy to have the privilege to be here in the Rautenstrauch Museum and moderate this panel with 4 brilliant minds and so many more brilliant minds in the audience. I would like to make this an open discussion. We would discuss here for about half an hour maybe, and then I would open the floor for your on-point, short comments and questions, and I will make sure they will on-point and short, because I would like to give as many people the possibility and the space to say something. Very briefly, I would like to introduce our panelist. Patrick Barnas is a German author and editor for the newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He worked for the FAZ as a cultural correspondent in New York, in Munich, and now in Cologne. Nanette Snoep is hosting us today. She's the director of the Rautenstrauch Museum. She's Dutch and worked before at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris and the Staatliche Ethnographische Sammlungen in Saxony. And we have Christian Kopp. He's a, I would call him public intellectual in Berlin, and an activist with Berlin Post-Colonial. That's an initiative that tries to establish a decolonial debate in the German capital and in Germany. And Bibero Lehmann, she is an author and historian here from Cologne, and she organizes with many other BPOCs the Black History Month here in Cologne, giving a voice especially to local women of color. So I was told that unfortunately I couldn't come yesterday and the day before, and I was told it was very exciting and a very emotional debate. And maybe we can take advantage of my position of not knowing anything, and I would love, Bibero and Christian, maybe you could explain to me what happened. And as you will notice, I'm not talking that very complicated academic language, so yeah, feel free also to express yourself in normal language. So go ahead. Who wants to?
Yeah. What happened so far? I think we had a problematic start of this conference, but I don't want to go into detail on this again. But I'd rather like to focus on the is it better like this? Okay. I'd rather like to focus on the on the second day and on the incredible how should I put it? On the Let me start again. So I'd rather focus on the second day and on the incredible dynamic I think we created here. Besides this problematic start. So, and I think we created here a very important public also, with very important and very powerful voices from scientists, from experts from the global south. Who are and this is maybe what we learned from the second day, who are at the same time affected from colonial continuities differently, and who at the same time feel the pain that is caused by the fact that the objects and the subjects that were taken in this colonial context are still in these museums, in these collections, in these archives in Germany and in Europe. And we learned that it's not you're either an expert or you're an emotional person, but in fact you're always both. And I think these experts, they had very important messages for us about the colonial crimes that brought these objects and these subjects here, and then about the importance of the return of these objects and subjects, and the importance of telling these histories that are connected to these objects and subjects, and to be very sensitive also about who is telling these stories. And we also learned a lot about healing processes and how museums in the global south or on the African continent, at the example of Uganda, can be places for healing processes. And just one last sentence, and I think it's very urgently needed to listen and to reflect also on our positions here in Cologne, in Germany, in Europe, and how our societies are also still affected from colonial continuities.
Thank you so much. Maybe we would like to add something, but I'm a journalist, and when I hear problematic start, I get really, really interested in knowing what that problematic start was. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit and tell me what is about that problem that was apparently also very clear on maybe this stage.
I would like to start. I would like to start not directly with the first day, but maybe tell you two stories, and if I succeed that you get the message, then you can easily imagine how uncomfortable I felt during the first day. The first story is about an information board we will, together with the Berlin Senate, will erect or introduce and give over to the public in a couple of days. And it's telling the story of, it is placed in front of the site of the former Reichskolonialministerium, so the Ministry for the Colonies in Berlin. And it is not telling the story of this building or of this office, but it's trying to change the perspective on colonial history by telling the story of 18 people who came together in Berlin after being asked to give their opinion on German colonialism. And all these 18 people came from former German colonies, from Cameroon and East Africa. And they didn't answer by themselves, just individually, but came together and worked on a collective answer. And they handed in their petition, which they wrote, with 32 points of improvement and complaint, especially concerning the German colonial regime. They handed it in, and what happened was that these very strong complaints about German colonialism were kind of censored in a very subtle way. So the Colonial Office took out the harsh critique, all 32 points, and the harsh critique in the beginning in the preamble, and published it. So it was estranged from the people. It pretended to be their opinion, but it wasn't. The second story I want to tell is that yesterday when we assembled here and talked about these very important subjects, emotionally, intellectually, and so on, a German very high official, the president of the federal states, federal council, Günther, went to Namibia. And he was, I would say, pretending to be on a journey to apologize or somehow to reconcile what is between the Germans and the Overheredo and the Nama. But he was not willing to meet the Overheredo and Nama. He just talked to the Namibian parliament. And then he went to a place, I didn't know how it went out, but I heard that protests were planned already, to the mass graves of the Overheredo Nama in Swakopmund, to lay down some flowers. But what I sensed on the social media was that the Overheredo were not happy about this. This was not a reconciling gesture because they were excluded by this.
So there's a lack of inclusion of people who are basically affected by the whole story.
Yeah,
That's the main critique.
and I would then apply this to the first day when we, as Germans, we invite guests. I would suspect them to, or expect them to sit at least half and half and balanced on the panel, and not having a panel of white men my age talking what we can listen to every day here. But to show it as a kind of politeness, I think it's a very reasonable and very easy to understand way. So this was the first day, and I was close to leave the conference. It was a very different day yesterday because of these voices who were excluded during the first day, I think.
Thank you. Talking about white men, let's talk about German journalism. This, I would say, is a semi-public space. Patrick Barnas, you work for a wider public, also discussing topics that were here apparently an emotional issue for so many people. How about the representation of those perspectives, not only in your newspaper, but overall in the German journalistic cultural debate when it comes to decolonizing, for example, museums?
Well, I think it's really no question that those perspectives have been neglected and are still being neglected to the extent that the very neglect has become a part of the story and a part of the argument. And it often happens with these controversies, sort of moral, let's say moral politics, where you can't find an easy way out by saying, well, we're just interested in the matter of the argument, whoever raises the argument. But there are questions where the who raises the argument, who do you ask, is also has to be part of the conversation. That's without question. And in my experience, looking back on some of those controversies about civil rights and especially issues of memory, in Germany, it's very often really embarrassing sort of to look back at how the story unfolded and then to think, well, why didn't we ask these people earlier? And well, as far as the colonial history is concerned, I think that it has taken off. Now it has become a big point of debate in the newspapers and also some high-level officials. Whatever one may think, one should have to ask people who were there yesterday in Namibia. But at least it's also a fact, a symbolic fact, that someone like the president of the Bundesrat did make this journey, and of course will have thought beforehand about what to do also in a symbolic fashion. So I think that these matters are changing, but I'm afraid if you would look at least I can only talk for my own newspaper, and make the kind of tests which it seems was applied to the composition of the panels on Monday, we would not look very good, of course.
Another kind of public space is a museum. My Moroccan mom would kill me because I did research. I tried to stay polite, but I have to read all those numbers about this museum. In 2006, 8.3 million euros in subventions were invested in this museum. It had, in the same year, 58,173 visitors, which means that each visitor costed 142.8 142 euros 80 cents in tax money. According to another study, most visitors of German museums are females over 55 years. Probably most of them are white females after 55 years and couples who are forced to come to the museum. What I would like to ask you is, for whom do you do all this amazing work first, and how can you open this space so you have a diverse public coming?
I just would like to mention that it is just for 6 months as here I'm in Cologne. But before I was 4 years in Saxony, directing 3 museums, and therefore I was in Paris for 16 years. So, of course, I started my museum career in 1995 in Paris. And I consider my job as trying this attempt to open up the museum. So I hear your comment, and I can say yes. Our audience, there is no diversity in our audience, and this is a problem. And I think this is exactly the good age, the good time to change this actively. So for me, it was very important also after 5 months to host this symposium here, this international conference, and to be able, thanks to all those universities, to be able to invite such amount of intellectuals from the global south. So it is an ongoing process, and I'm also a little bit impatient, and I must admit that comparing to Paris, in Germany it is very white. The staff is very white, our audience is very white, and the museum is very white thought. So that is... So,
do you have an analysis why it is?
Why? Because this museum, the concept is a 19th century concept. The ethnological museum, the concept was to speak about the other. So it has produced this kind of otherness. Of course, there was also curiosity for otherness, a good curiosity, but not only good curiosity for otherness. And we say already since the 80s that the ethnological museum is in a crisis. Okay, now we are in 2019, so we could be a little bit impatient, but I think also maybe thanks to activists, particularly here in Germany, because the French and the Dutch, because I'm Dutch, the Dutch and the French context is very, very different, but I really have the feeling that we are on a good way.
On the local level, is there a difference between public here in Cologne and in Dresden?
Yes, completely. I don't want to blame Saxony.
No, just go ahead, blame people. Just
I
go
was
ahead.
for 4 years.
They are watching.
I had bad luck coming to Saxony because I was in Paris. I had a great job, and I got a telephone call from a headhunter in order to direct 3 museums in Saxony. I was absolutely not German orientated, I must admit. My direction was always Southern Europe, so I was more able to speak about Italian museums or Spanish museum as about German museums. So I was very interested in this job because I was a little bit fed up with the Front National in Paris. But, and then the first Pegida demonstrations started in October 2014, exactly a couple of days before I signed my contract.
Willkommenskultur, say.
So Saxony is a completely different, but at the same time, I came in this very, very big violence, and I must admit that extreme right has written my first arrival in Germany, and I'm still very, very moved about it. And I have a lot of anger about my first years. But it was also a very good opportunity. If you see this racism in Saxony, and at the same time you have 3 ethnological museums, 350,000 objects, and you have a completely white audience with only men and women 60 years and older, if it was not 70 years or 80 years or older, then you have a mission. And so we started to work against Pegida inside the museum. So it was also an interesting experience, but not after 4 years I would like to leave this region.
I can really understand why. Thank you for that. I would like to invite you to come and join us here if you would like. We have chairs, there's water, but also you can stay where you are and just give me a sign if you want to comment. And I have a couple of other questions, and I saw this one here, one sign, so I just wanted to invite you to come and join us here. The one thing is talking to our wide public. The other thing is talking to the own community. And this is what you are doing, Bibero Lehmann, with organizing, for example, the Black History Month. Do you deal with white decision makers here in the city? Why is it important to organize this kind of event here on the local level?
Thank you for your question. Before I answer this, I want to quickly say something about the fact that there is no diversity under the visitors of the museum or of museums like this one. It's not only here the case. And I will put it short. It's just it is because how these places make you feel when you enter them and when you visit the main exhibition, and you are an Afro-German woman like me, or you are a German person but with another family background, like second, third generation migration, something from the global south and from a former colony. And then you enter these spaces and you have still this otherness. And then all of a sudden you are actually German, but you get constructed as the other as well. And you have a reproduction of colonial racist stereotypes and images. And this also hurts to look at it sometimes. And this is why if exhibitions are put like this, people are not interested in visiting them, and then there can't be diversity in the audience. But we also have a good example here in the house. I think the exhibition Noisy Images, because it really breaks this otherness and the view of we and the others. And yeah, so I think I just wanted to add this. And now your question on what I'm doing.
More or less, yeah, that was the question.
And why it's important to organize these spaces. Okay, yeah. With the Black History Month, I think it's very important to organize spaces for Afro-German history, for Afro-German culture, for art, for exchange, for networking, because we still don't have enough of these spaces here in Germany. And especially Afro-German history is still something we don't really learn in school, so I think we need other spaces where we can learn this history. But it's also about, it's not, and I think these are also spaces of empowerment, but it's not only for the Afro-German community, but it's also to show the white majority society that in fact there are Black people and people of African descent in this country for a very, very long time, and that being Black and being German should be normal in 2019, and we should not always have to deal with this question, where do you come from? Yeah, but where do you really come from? And so on and so forth. So I think it's a space for both, but it's not only to deal with the white majority society, because this can also be exhausting, and as I said, we don't have enough places for and spaces for empowerment yet in this country. Yeah.
But also as a Patrick Barners, as a a person of color, I observe certain skepticism towards the white majority society. Where is this coming from? How would you explain that so many communities of color, they just don't trust fully and 100% when Emmanuel Macron comes and say, we are doing restitution, which is apparently not happening. How do you see this discussion? How do you see this skepticism from certain communities?
Well, one reason I suppose for skepticism would be that I mean the very presence of a part of the German people also statistically, just to start with numbers, just also statistically relevant section of the German people is in part of a descent which statistically goes can go with a skin color which looks different from white, so-called white. I think this was not acknowledged for a very long time in Germany. I mean, the whole question of the colonial era in German history, German part in colonization, it was treated as an episode. It was treated as a sideshow. When I look back on my own studies of history, nearby at the University of Bonn, sort of you knew there were, let's say, 2 or 3 professors of history in the whole of Germany who would deal with the colonial past. Whereas obviously, if you went to Paris, to London, and of course also to the Netherlands, it would be apparent that those countries would not have this way out. As I said before, it's sometimes strange then to look back upon certain debates, even certain publishing phenomena that for example, yes, someone would write a best-selling book as a black German, and it would become a bestseller for a very, very good reason, because it is a good book and it's very interesting to read it. But sort of if you look at what was probably at least part of the logic behind people making some kind of the decisions involved, maybe not the decision to publish the original book, but then to feature the book. I think one has to acknowledge, one has to be honest about this, that there was still some kind of an exotic factor in having books like these. Well, I can only hope that this is now sort of, I don't know whether it disappears, but that it sort of, this can't be the way to deal with it. But yes, I think that sort of, as far as the colonial past is concerned, there was for a long time, sort of, it was even on an intellectual level, sort of, it was sort of questioned whether sort of you didn't really rather need some kind of artificial theoretical work, some work of comparison, in order to have people acknowledge the importance of the subject. I mean, there is this question of the genocide during the German colonial period in Southwest Africa, and I don't want to take sides. I don't want to say anything material on this point, but just sort of one observation as regarding the kind of discussion which already now for a very, very long time took place, but sort of how it started. That there was a historian now at the University of Hamburg, Jürgen Zimmerer, who sort of constructed a theoretical argument with very, very good points. So you really had to answer him. He made a theoretical argument with whom many of you will be familiar, of course, because it turned out that it then became very influential. He made an argument that you could compare, and you had to compare what happened in Southwest Africa before the First World War with what happened the mass murders of the Nazis. So my point is just this: that this sort of effort was necessary. That it wasn't enough simply to say, well, there is this genocide done by Germans, so we should do research about it, and of course there should be a political reckoning with it. But that sort of Zimmerer had to take sort of the door within German scholarship of unfolding a very, very elaborate theoretical argument. That shows you something about sort of how unprepared also maybe the more general intellectual public in Germany was for these kind of topics, let's say 15 years ago, maybe already also 10 years ago.
Thank you for that. Christian, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would like to add that taking Jürgen Zimmerer aside, it is often said that German society has kind of forgotten about this, and it was in the shadow of the Holocaust, and that's why it was not talked about. After years of engaging with this subject, I'm really convinced that this was a very deliberate act to avoid talking about it. It was not a society. I'm convinced that a society cannot forget if it doesn't want to forget. And if we have a development now, as I see it, a more open debate on these subjects, I'm sure it wouldn't have been only with people like Jürgen Zimmerer, but it is black activists being active here and being active in the former colonies and bringing these subjects on the table. I could even explain it maybe personally. I would not sit here if there wasn't people like my colleague Nyakasoro Romboro, who talked yesterday, and who has taught me over 10 years what colonialism means to descendants of the colonized. So this is, I think, a point we should never forget, and even the whole discussion we have here wouldn't be possible without the activists who have come and the experts who have come here, who stayed at home, but who live here as well.
Thank you for that. And there's a lot of work to do, and one is just passing the mic so people can participate. And we have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't think that I have directly a question. My name is Oliver Lüb. I'm the curator for Oceania here at the Raudenschau-Just Museum, and I joined the museum in 2008. So I just would like to give some further comment. It is interesting to hear the numbers, but I really would like to just set the environment for that. So when we are talking about 2008, that was the year before the museum was closed. And it was the decision already taken that this building was set up. So part of the 4.8 million euros you mentioned went into the building here. So it was not the money for the old building over there. And because it was already the time of the closing, we only had 48,000 visitors. So that is just an understanding. It was not pushing the money into an existing museum. It was already closing. We were supposed to close at the end of 2008, and then it was postponed for half a year to close in 2009. So it's a bit unfair. I'm not sitting here to defend.
Great argument, but thank you so much for elaborating on that.
Some of the
it's
content.
It's very important where the tax money is going, so
yes,
thank you for that.
I totally agree with you. So another point, talking about the always coming up question of white visitors, old people, and so on. For my own history, I really can say that when I grew up in Germany, I didn't have any people with people of colors in my Schul classes, because in the 1970s, 80s, nobody was here. I'm coming from the countryside. I did not live in a capital, and I haven't only seen 2 or 3 people from Vietnamese at the time when boat people arrived in Germany. And I think it's, from my point of view, it's a part of the specific German history that only in the 1960s a bigger amount of people from other countries arrived here due to economic reasons. And the people who came at that time did not have a proper education. Most of them accrued here to be part of the Fortwerke in Cologne or in other areas, so industrial workers, because that was the reason why people came. And I think when we opened here in 2010, we became a member of audience development program for North Rhine-Westphalia as one of the first museums who took place in that working group. One of the first findings was that it's very difficult to transform a person with a low education to a museum goer than instead of bringing first a higher education. And it's really difficult to compare apple with pears. Yeah. So I think we really have to anticipate the development of the German society. So when we are today looking for a proper amount of people who reflect the demographic development, then that's fair.
Thank you so much. Bebero would like to comment on that, and then Nanette.
I think it's just really not true that there were no other people, and that we just have a significant migration in Germany starting in the 1960s. In fact, we also have a significant migration as early as the late 19th century from the then at the time German colonial territories on the African continent. And we don't just have this migration, this significant migration, but we also have a political self-organization of these people in the 1920s and 1930s. And one example is the one that Christian just mentioned, but there are more examples of anti-colonial activisms, and we have family histories like the one of Theodor Michael, who is living here in Cologne, and whose father came from Cameroon around 1900 and was one also of these activists from the former African colonies. And I could even bring more examples. But I think this is not the main point why we are here. I think, and this is something Nanette first said when she opened the conference, and it's about decolonization. And one part of decolonization is restitution, and how we critically reflect on our colonial past, also here in this country, and how we then hopefully finally overcome the colonial continuities that are still also in our society here. And I think for the purpose of decolonization, it is urgently needed, and it's an exceptional chance here at this conference to listen to more voices of the experts from the Global South, and to just listen and to learn and to reflect, and also to reflect one's own position. And so I would really like to have more of this on this panel, and to use some panel time for this, because I think there was not enough space for these voices yet here. And I think I shouldn't take so much space either. I think there should be other voices here now.
And you are still very welcome to come and join us here, or just give me a sign if you would like to comment or ask a question. But Nanette wanted also to comment.
Yeah, I would like to add something. And we can speak about white audiences, we can speak about the history of immigration here in Germany, but it is a fact, and I'm sorry to to contradict you, Oliver, that museums have mostly a white audience. I go to Amsterdam, where maybe it's a little bit more, it's maybe Amsterdam is a little bit more colored, or even in Paris, but still the fact is that the people you find in the street, you don't find them in a museum. And of course, we are doing, and also the Rausdorff Joost Museum, they worked with the diaspora here in Cologne, but still today there are people here in Cologne, they don't feel themselves welcome. Well, you can say as director or as curator, this is not true, but this is a fact. And I think this is really for the upcoming decade that we have to work on this. I wanted to tell this because I think it is very important, as well at the same time, to invite people from the global south in order to speak here on the, and I'm, as well as in our audience, that it is an open museum for everybody, and this is the future of the so-called ethnographic museums, perhaps.
A small other question, because Bibiru talked about restitution as part of the whole debate. When are you shipping the first objects overseas? When are you shipping the first objects overseas? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I must admit, because I'm sometimes a little bit severe, I know. I spoke about my first Saxonian experience, but we can be very proud on the Rausdorff Joost Museum, I must admit, if you compare it to other ethnological museums in Germany and even in Europe. So we have wonderful storages, the objects, and really I do not lie. Last year, proactively, so it has been initiated by the Rausdorff Joost Museum, and the Rausdorff Joost Museum sent back Toi Moiko to New Zealand. So the Rausdorff Joost Museum has a very, very long tradition. Even if you visit the exhibition, even if you can criticize it, but in comparing to other museums, you can find elements about the German colonial history. In 2004, there was an exhibition on Namibia and so on. So this we must take into account.
Acknowledge
also.
that, yes.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself quickly and then...
Thank you very much. My name is Wandile Kasibe. I am based in South Africa, Cape Town, but I wasn't born there. I was born in the eastern part of the country, in a township called Mdantsane. It's not far away from a city called, or a town called East London. So we have an East London in South Africa. So you can then, understand the context in which, I was born. So yeah, I think that's enough.
Yeah, and maybe you have a comment, you have a question?
No, I just, mine is basically just to, understand. I mean, coming from the global south, and coming into a space that for the longest time, that resources, natural resources, have been extracted from the continent to feed the empire. Extracting resources to feed the empire, and that goes hand in hand again with the idea of, for example, Africa being used as as a lab, as a space where certain genocidal ideas were experimented on bodies. And these are bodies who, for centuries had been marked with, or rather earmarked or understood as not belonging in the category, in the human category. And what does it mean for those voices when they arrive in spaces like this? Whether the degree of hospitality is being extended to those voices, and speaking here, knowing very well that it was at a conference not similar to this in 1884, 1885, when Africa was divided into boundaries. Meeting chaired by Otto von Bismarck at the time, and attended by other, European powers. The United States was also part of that meeting. And the outcome, the resolution of that meeting had, or still has, far-reaching, effect. That if you go back to Africa today, the boundaries are still there. And the decision was taken at a meeting, a global meeting, an international congress of superpowers who put Africa at the center as, as a cake that had to be divided. And this cake, had people like myself who have identities, with names, who come from cultural groupings, who come from, cultures that make up, or that, make up the different diverse cultures that make up the continent. Now, the superpowers sit down in a context like this, and then they decide, you will take Southwest Africa, you will take northern parts of Africa, and Germany took Southwest Africa as one of the colonies. And we know for sure what happened in 1904 to 1908, when Lothar von Trotha then started to issue out an extermination order. That extermination order flattened out the whole population of the Nama and the Herero. And the legacies of a decision that was taken at a congress like this, a decision was taken at a congress like this, and with far-reaching effect, that today we can see, if you go back to those geographies today, you can see that, there's a lot that we still need to do in terms of, the issue of restitution. Because it's an issue that cannot be, we cannot run away from it, because it speaks, it pierces through the soul of humanity. It lies at the heart of the consciousness of our postmodern world. So even this particular gathering, a resolution can be taken here to deal with issues that you know very well have connection to those kinds of troubling histories. So I think for me, for now, that's the issue that I think perhaps we need to think about. Importance of resolutions that are taken at a meeting. They can either have far-reaching positive, effect, or they can have far-reaching negative effect. So I don't underestimate a gathering of this nature, because it's a gathering of minds that are coming from different geographies, and therefore a decision that is taken at a congress like this can either catapult us into new futures, or it can take us back to 100 years ago.
Yes, thank you for that. Also listening to this version of reality, of the history, I would like to connect this with the reframing of the so-called shared cultural world heritage, which is happening in Berlin, especially with the Humboldt Forum. Taking this history, which is still untold, as we heard before, and reframing it as rather shared heritage that is very belonging to different geographies. What are your thoughts, especially if you are in Berlin-Mitte, Christian, looking at that giant palace?
Usually I try to close my eyes and...
There's traffic there. I would not recommend that.
Yeah, we have been engaged in this campaign, No Humboldt 21, for more than 5 years now. And because we had the feeling before this building site started even, that this is a big mistake this society is doing, the politicians who had decided on this. as it is from the bottom up a very colonial project. We have the structure which is enough for people who know not to go inside, and I especially mean the descendants of colonized people, because you talked about the Berlin Africa Conference. It is the palace of William I. It is the palace of William II responsible for the genocide in Namibia, and it is responsible for it is the building of the great elector and the Prussian king Frederick I, who was a slave trader. So people, I guess, who knew about this or know about this story wouldn't even enter it without any other things added. But now we've got the objects there who claim to return to their origin by one of the curators of the Humboldt Forum, which is the palace, in his opinion, leaving out the whole story where they came from. So I sensed a very strong feeling, especially when I talked to my colleague Mboro, that this is kind of mocking the descendants of the colonized, and he would never enter this building. So this could be a comment on how can we transform other museums who don't have this very heavy colonial atmosphere like this maybe, but are still very deeply involved in coloniality. How can we ever? I mean, I'm still wondering why we're all here, in fact, with all these objects who are silenced in a way, and other museums where there are basements with thousands of human remains in it, the ancestors in it. So we can be, I think, as white people and descendants of colonists, we can be very happy that there's someone coming at all in this.
Still, you are very welcome to join. Patrick Barnas, the Humboldt Forum as a colonial project. What do you think?
Well, I'm no big fan of the Humboldt Forum. I think it's really embarrassing, really big embarrassment with all the money and all the intellectual energy, all the manpower which has gone into it. They have come up with pretty little, and the exhibitions they made, the sort of trial runs of what they want to show, were not a big success either with the critics or with the general public. But actually, I don't think that there is sort of a colonial mastermind, a colonial idea, or sort of the deep hidden presence, underestimated presence of colonialism behind it. I suspect the very opposite is true. If the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz had known how controversial the idea would turn out to be, to put the Dahlem collections into the rebuilt Schloss, they would never have done it. It was just a convenient thing to do. There are many contingent aspects with dealing with the questions. What would have been the alternatives? Could, for example, the Gemäldegalerie from Kulturforum have been moved to the palace, so that one would have had a German Louvre with the Renaissance paintings in the former palace. So it was a convenient thing to do from a practical point of view, and then it was connected with this as it turned out, very naive idea that there is an uncontaminated German tradition of universalism with the brothers Humboldt. So I think it's sort of a little like what Seeley said about the British Empire. The Humboldt Forum, as it now stands, is sort of one of the biggest accidents in post-war European history. It wasn't planned this way, and I think one doesn't understand the people behind it if one sort of thinks of people like Partzinger or even Horst Bredekamp as sort of latter-day colonialists. Having said this, I want also to say something to what Mr. Kopp said about sort of looking into the future. Of course, it would be presumptuous for me as for anybody to to speak for the future audience and to say, well, who will go into it and who won't. This is simply a practical matter. Everybody will be free to enter it. Hopefully, won't even have to pay. And I think one general thing needs to be said as far as regards the public, be it of museums, being the readers of newspapers, be it people going to the theater. You can put money, a lot of effort into audience building and audience outreach. But in the end, it's the audience which has to come. It's the audience which has to take the offer. And you can't force anyone to go into a museum, at least in a country like Germany. You can't do it. And so I would, as I said, I'm not a big fan of the Humboldt Forum. I'm not very curious about what sort of the plans which they have come up with. But I'm not as pessimistic as Mr. Kopp as regards the Humboldt Forum as a former royal palace. I mean, people go into former royal palaces which have been turned into museums all the time. Most big museums in the old capitals of Europe are housed in former palaces. And for example, the Louvre and also our Gemäldegalerie, the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, they are full of, mostly the old stuff, full of pictures from Catholic churches. Does this mean that the descendants of Huguenots or the descendants of German Protestants or the descendants of Waldensians or the descendants of Jews who were persecuted for the whole of modern German history, does it mean that they don't go into these museums? No, this is not true.
Thank you. We have two reactions, one on this side and one on the other.
This just confirms that the whole project of the making of the Humboldt Forum is about making Germany European, making Germany Western. My name is Siraj Rasool from Cape Town, South Africa, and I have been able to participate in some of the events and the gatherings and the consultations along the road of the making of the Humboldt Forum. And it's been very interesting how much has been forgotten along the way, and how during this time the Humboldt Forum is a self-forgetting project. And let us also acknowledge that in the last 4 or 5 years or so, a profound shift has occurred from one where the debate in Germany about ethnological collections refused an association with the colonial. Today, we cannot talk about the future of ethnology without connecting it directly to colonialism and violence. In a conference that took place in Bonn in early 2016, in which Larissa Förster and I were invited to participate, one of the 3 leaders then of the Humboldt Forum publicly declared that Germans are fortunate to have had a short colonial experience, and as a consequence thereof, Germany is relatively untouched by colonialism. And it just struck one how inappropriate it is for that project to be led by someone who makes that kind of argument. So today, we talk about the future of the Ethnological Museum in Europe as one which has to be grounded in the politics of restitution.
Thank you for that. There is, you want to ask, there's here? Can you just raise your hand very high? Yes. Yeah, da hinten. And then Felvin.
Thank you very much. I'm I really want to add something because I want to talk about colonial collections and their publics, and I'm here for the public. I'm not a member of any university, I'm not a scientist, nothing. I'm just a normal taxpayer, and I'm really, as the museums use the tax money, I have to provide services for the public. I really want to demand better concepts. And if the idea is in the room that I need a master degree to enter a museum, I really do not agree. And it's always easy to blame the other person than to think about the concept itself. So I really, really disagree with the idea that we have to blame any other person than the museum itself. And I really demand that the concepts are changing and that the museum become an inclusive place for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Felvine Saar?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Felvine, you can give him the
Okay,
microphone.
no,
He has as much time as he wants.
Yes. No, I just wanted to add a word on the idea of a museum as an inclusive place. There is a work of a French sociologist, Bourdieu, around the idea that a museum is not a place for everyone. You know, it's meant to be a place to educate the people, but you have to learn to look at a painting. If you don't have artistic education, it's a place for an elite. And this question of the museum, how to deal with the inclusiveness of the museum is absolutely a deep question. In Senegal, El Hadji Malick Ndiaye has shown that the Senegalese don't want to look themselves in ethnographic objects. But if you put them with the contemporary aspect of these objects, they are interested. But all the question of, it's the question of theater and museum, how to reach what we call a popular audience. And it's always a question, because there is a grammar of the discourse and how to deal with this idea with the displays and the grammar of the discourse to make it open to a wider audience. I think it's a global issue around popular culture, elite places, and how to bridge these places and to go through it. So it's a difficult question, but it's a question: who is going to the museum? Is the one who had the linguistic, the cultural, the intellectual codes, you know, to be able to read what is displayed in the museums.
Thank you for that. You want to add something?
Yeah, thank you. This will be a very brief one around the Humboldt Forum. We have one elephant in the room, which I think it really needs to be addressed when it comes to, you know, talking about, I think, such a massive institution. You know, and yes, the colonial aspect. But I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was a cry that, you know, more than 500 million, if I'm correct, you know, has been spent to build the institution. I could be wrong, but that's what I read. Now, at the very heart, at the core of this, it boils down to the economics of the colonial project. And the diasporas from the geography where the genocide took place in Southwest Africa have been crying in the metropolis in this part of the world, crying for one thing: recognize this inhumane act that took place in the period when German soldiers occupied Southwest Africa. And I'm not quite sure if such a huge amount of money has been spent just to build a memorial to acknowledge this inhumane act. And we have then a museum. I'm not saying that, I'm not really anti-spending the money on museums, but I think there needs to be also an element of extending the same gesture in understanding that a pain was caused on a people. Not unless we don't see them as people in the same way that we see other people as people. Or not unless we don't recognize the pain as a pain that comes from a place of humanity. Then it means that then we will have to then go back and begin to re-question the whole notion of social Darwinist discourse, which located black African people as the missing link between the so-called modern human beings and the animal kingdom. And that justified the whole process of occupying their lands, because colonial forces such as the German forces were able to justify that we're not committing any acts of injustice because these people have been scientificized. It has been concluded that they are not real human beings, and therefore their pain is not the same as our pain. So it means that then we almost have to really question the genesis and the socio-political DNA of how institutionalized racism still unfolds in many subtle ways. How we deal with the other, how we acknowledge or disacknowledge the pain of the other. It's still an expression of the kind of racism that actually must be dealt with in spaces such as this one. And it may seem as something normal to others, but it is a pain that sits at the heart of our conscience as humanity. And a global platform such as this one must actually begin to make a public declaration, dealing or exorcising the demon of racism, which actually affects in many different ways. So I think that we have an opportunity here to deal with that, or we have an opportunity here to ignore that it exists and continue to ignore the voices of the diasporas who are protesting every single day, calling in the wilderness. And we must be able to begin to deal with those kinds of issues, because it's the same manifestation of the kind of racism that is actually incorporated and entrenched in the modern psyche. But to some people, they may not see it, but it is there. So what is our role really as, people from the rest of the world in dealing with the issue of how do we make sure that the voices that are calling for justice, those voices are actually given the platform so that issues of justice are being dealt with. In the same way that, MLK once said, our lives begin to stop the moment we become silent about things that matter. The moment we decide to take a neutral line in the face of justice, in fact, we support injustice. Because injustice, everywhere is a threat to justice, everywhere or anywhere. The moment if there's injustice here, it's a threat if there's injustice here, it's a threat to justice almost anywhere you would actually go. So I think that we have really, a perfect opportunity to deal with the issues that most people are actually scared to deal with.
Thank you very much for linking. Thank you very much for linking the discussion to that system of oppression that is not only working in museums, but also in other spaces. We had a reaction there.
Geht schon, soll ich's nicht? Ja. Okay. My name is Christoph Antweiler, Bonn University, Asian Studies. I'm an anthropologist. I have a critical remark. First of all, if I experience it personally here, it comes from me over more, less as a panel discussion, but more as a, let's say, public ritual. And one can discuss whether a museum is the proper place for it. But in concrete, I have a critical remark. I think we are discussing here a post-colonial situation, but if I see the categories used, they come to me sometimes as a little colonial or even pre-colonial. So we had many, let's say dualistic categories. Yeah, there was talk of old people as if old people wouldn't be diverse, or we have a little bit racialized talk, and it's a talk. We reduce all the topic to Africa and then compare it to Germany, and there's a sort of national epistemic nationalism included. So I think in a museum, and if we also scientists are included, we should, in a post-colonial situation, I think we should use more analytical categories like asymmetrical power and relations of dependency and relations of network. But I experience as a replication of very old categories which we use for talking about these. For example, talking about Germany as if Germany would be an isolated country. Or I often heard Global South, but how it was used only as a new word for third world. But if we speak of Global South, we should not speak only about Germany, but Germany in a global north. So that would be my critical remark. Thank you.
I'd like to quickly answer this. Global South is actually a very useful scientific term. And here in Cologne, we actually have the Global South Study Center, which also organized this whole conference. And
let her please finish, and then you can have also the opportunity.
And they also published more about the scientific term, so it in fact is. And also, racism is. I think it's really important to just name it as it is, and it's an important category. And I think last year, was it, at the Historikertag, it was finally also discussed and seen that we have a history of racism in this country that reaches back to the history, to the colonial times, and that is also, there are continuities you can trace. And so this was discussed at this Historikertag. So I think it's totally legitimate and also important to talk about racism in this, in spaces like this here in the museum. And to me and to a lot of people, in fact, in this country, it's also not just a category, but it's also an experience, like an everyday experience. And I think it's important to also not forget that, and to pretend as if we should talk theoretical, and then this is scientific, and then we talk about the
imagination of an objectivity, maybe.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Erhard was the next.
Erhard? Yeah. Would you please quickly let me come through here? I'm going to keep the microphone. So I'm going to keep the microphone.
Really? Yes, I'd like to follow up on this question of the Humboldt Forum, because it was mentioned that one of the three leaders said that the German colonial period was short, but as we know, none of these leaders are anthropologists, and they were supposed to lead an anthropological museum. And I have this feeling in this discussion of anthropology that the decapacitation of anthropology concerning the Humboldt Forum will be answered by more deep capacitations of anthropology as a discipline or as a museum discipline. So I would like to come back to the question also what we suppress in our talks. And I'd like to give just a very short run of German history as far as colonialism and imperialism is involved. So there are things that are suppressed in our memories too, because after all, it is not only Africa and the Pacific that are involved. That was the first German colony or Prussian colony was Poland. So for more than 130 years, Poland was partitioned, and it was a German colony like Ireland was a British colony or an English colony. And we had the biggest brutal and cruel and consequent colonization campaign in the Second World War with the Generalplan Ost, which is basically the basis for everything that happened after the war. And we keep forgetting that we are not stopped being imperialist power in 1919, colonial power, but it was in 1945. So we have suppressed many more layers of colonial memories and colonialism as a way of thought, and of racism, of course, too, that are linked with German history and that haven't been mentioned basically during the discussions. So if we look at German history and everything that it involves, we have to go through things that are so crucial for example, for this whole term that was mentioned in between, crime against humanity. It comes from a German colonial imperialist period, and it is a very crucial period for everything that happened then in the human rights organizations after 1945. So we have to link this in our memory also with the questions of Africa, Pacific, and even, for example, the Boxer campaign in China. So I would appeal to people to look at German history also in a non-linear and non-dimensional way, just linking it with this question of anthropology and colonialism. And the Humboldt Forum would be a perfect place, of course, to discuss these matters, but the amnesia runs really deep into many things that are partitioned, because our memories are partitioned into categories that have different museums, that have different ways of dealing with memory and different ways of making history. So this is just a reminder.
Okay, thank you for that reminder. Nanette would like to comment.
Yes, I just would like to say something, because the idea of this symposium was the collections in motion, and it is also about decolonization. And when we started our introduction on Monday morning, we said, yes, we are so happy, we will speak about decolonization, and then step by step came this critique from the audience, and then we discovered by ourselves also that we were speaking or we were expressing our wish to decolonize, and at the same time we had built a completely colonial frame. So I think it was during those 3 days, yesterday, there was a real catharsis, actually. And we could say, actually, the title of the symposium, I quote Anna Bruce, actually we could also title it Collections in Emotion. And I think a museum is also a place for emotion. And I think it is very dangerous also that as a museum always, that we try always to avoid this emotion. This emotion has to take place, and that's why we as museum are hosting this, and that we would like really to build an open space and to give space also for disagreement. And okay, maybe I'm not, and there is this disagreement here in this gallery, in this room, and it's good. And I would wish that we avoid, this is not academic, or, no, we are in a museum, here we are here in a room with very different emotions, feelings, and opinions, and this is the right place where we can discuss this, and disagreement is not dangerous, it's good, okay?
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
After we got remembered of the history of violence, German violence in Poland, I just like to also remember that German colonialism didn't stop after 1919. The German colonial project didn't stop after 1919. In fact, there was a very active pro-colonial movement in Germany that tried to get back the colonial territories in Africa, and it was supported, or it was there was this very active movement, and even the Nazis, they had plans on how to get back the colonies in Africa, and Hitler first claimed that this is important and that this should happen in 1936 in the Reichstag, and afterwards they developed big plans, and science should also play a major role In fact, they were convinced that ethnology, for example, should be a practical science that provides knowledge to colonize and then to colonize better this time. And they only stopped these plans after 1941, after what happened in the Soviet Union and after more military loss. So the colonial project and colonialism in Germany definitely continued also with regard to Africa after 1919.
It didn't stop with Independence Day in so many countries. Patrick Barnas, you?
I would like to take up the observation that we on this panel did sometimes use the idea of Germany in a way which at least struck you as a little bit old-fashioned, going back to the era of the nation state, and I think that's a point very well taken. But I also think that it more or less follows from the turn the debate on restitution has taken in this year. So now restitution of colonial artifacts has become really a topic very, very much discussed in Germany. It has high political priority. Why? Because it was picked up by the national government. And as you are aware, it used to be the case for a long time that the Bundesländer in Germany would say, well, everything connected with culture is our turf. The Bund has nothing to say about it. And this has changed, and this is now another example where the federal government and the Staatsministerinnen Grütters and Müntefering have said that this is a matter of national importance and we all have to do something about it. The museums are in the hands of the Länder, but it's a matter of national importance that something has to be done. And why was it so urgent for Ms. Grütters and Ms. Müntefering suddenly to comment on what's in the formerly so-called ethnological museums, after probably having never set foot there apart from a virtual pre-Humboldt Forum, pre-construction? Well, you all know the answer, because Mr. Macron, the President of France, made it a priority. So suddenly it became a matter of national prestige, not to fall behind. And we are all discussing now, and on the basis of the famous report, which Mr. Sarr and Benedict Savoy handed in to Mr. Macron and also to the European public. And if you read the report, you will find that the nation state is written into its very structure. You went to the Quai d'Orsay and you asked the lawyers of the Quai d'Orsay for their legal opinion. What's the way to proceed with restitutions? Who is going to be the recipient? And they told you, if you want to be on the safe side, all restitutions have to be made to the national governments as they now are in Africa. So the African national states are going to be, under the ideas of the report, are going to be the beneficiaries of this project of restitution, and the French national state is going to be its object. And I find it a little bit ironic that we have been reminded very pertinently of the deep structural impact of the Congress of Berlin on international law, when this very legal opinion by the Quai d'Orsay is a direct consequence of the fact that the Treaty of the Congress of Berlin is still part of international law. And so the lawyers at the Orsay said there is no alternative. These borders are still valid, and so there is no way we can go beyond the national governments and hand the artifacts to those communities which are below the national government. And one last point about the museum as an institution and this legal idea of inalienability or sort of permanent ownership a museum or the public has in its collection. One thing which I found, which struck me as a little bit strange in the last couple of months, was that this idea, which is in whatever legal form, I think it's sort of the basic premise under which all public museums, not only in the global north, but also elsewhere, operate, that this legal notion was sort of itself then described as a colonial concept, which because of this was suspect. Whereas if you look at it, how it came about, the first idea was that it should not be possible for the government of the day simply to sell a collection which they find in a public museum. So what I found really a little bit curious about the whole debate is that after all the institutional criticism and university departments, disciplines, they have all gone through this phase of institutional criticism, and it was a good thing. And now the museums are going through the same phase. But the one institution never criticized is the nation state. And I would suggest to you, maybe it would be worth a thought to separate museums, wherever you may find them, from the state and the state apparatus. And maybe it would be a good idea sort of not to force museums to hand back everything, because, well, to whom will you hand it? You will hand it to national governments.
We have 2 minutes left, and I still have an anecdote to share. So I asked my Egyptian friends in Berlin last Sunday if Germany should give the Nefertiti back, because I'm like a journalist and I like populism. So I asked them, and they answered, what, to that regime? You are sending them arms, and now you want to give them Nefertiti? So I was very interested in that reaction, because afterwards, of course, all of my friends, they were saying, and don't tell Pegida, all Egyptians have at the same time the right to see that very beautiful object. So how we can deal with this question of sharing that very important object that is maybe shared world heritage or reframed as shared world heritage. And it will be, I think, also in Germany, a huge discussion still in the future. And panels like this and conferences like this are part of that discussion. And I think they're very important. And this is not the end of the discussion. There is still like work, a text, as I heard, that is developed here. Maybe you can ask also us if you are interested to hear more about this, because it's now time I would hand the microphone to the organizers, and I would like to thank you on the stage and you in the public. Thank you.